The time has come, the Super Nintendo Mini is safely in my hands and hooked up, or as I now call it, the SMINI. You can read my comprehensive full review and comparison of just what nostalgic nibbles did offers up on the website, and just how it compares to its old school original. Now, ahead of getting hands-on for release, we already knew that the machine would be based on an identical board and SoC as the previous SNES Mini. Now, this is something I talked about in my preview back in the summer, which you can view with a link on screen below or on the website. Now, is this really a surprise on that score? The NES Mini hardware, which is also an ARM16 ARM SoC, just like the Super Nintendo Mini here, far exceeds the requirements of both of these machines and the inevitable N64 Mini next year. This includes more than enough computation to supplement the extra co-processors that Nintendo and third-party teams regularly included within many game cartridges over the console's lifespan. Now, these all shared a similar trait: an extra chip inside which can be used to supplement the weak 6502 family CPU that became a ball and chain due to cost cutting and an early attempt to deliver backwards compatibility with the NES Famicom it replaced. Now, this fell through but left the console with a huge chink within its armour compared to the Mega Drive or Genesis it was up against, and thus gave it more than a bloody nose at times. Now, as usual, software skills did help reduce the deficit here, with multi-platform programmers becoming skilled in getting around some of the machine's limitations. Rare stood proud for Nintendo on many occasions and stood equal with the mighty N on the 16 and 64-bit consoles throughout the generations. But a regular occurrence of the console and many titles is slowdown, which is ever present in many games, and I'll be looking at this and analysing how close it gets in emulation here to emulate those CPU timings and the bandwidth of the older machine. With the need for extra processing clear from the start, launch titles in the US and UK such as Pilot Wings, they used a DSP-1 chip to deliver impressive and typical Nintendo style of non-categorized games. Star Fox and its UK developed RISC-based Mario chip, the mathematical Argonaut rotation input-output, yes, Argonaut was the company that built it, with later versions simply called the GSU-1. They grabbed all the headlines from the machine later into the lifespan, but the need for these was consistent, if not exhaustive, from the start. This new Mini has many titles that rely on many of these extra chips, including the more powerful GSU-2 SP1, which had better yields and as such was allowed to use the complete set of pinouts, giving it access to the full 21 MHz rather than the 10.5 MHz and twice the ROM size from 8 megabits to 16. The lion's share of titles though use the SH1, another CPU just like the stock one inside the Super Nintendo, but due to the fact that it was so weak, this basically enhances it with the same multiplication and division processes, but at a higher clock rate and some additional features such as bitmap to bitplane conversion, which essentially helps it speed up the visual quality on screen to the PPU. So how can the same 4-core ARM CPU and Mali GPU cope with this extra horsepower? Well, quite easily, as these are simply another CPU that Nintendo just so happened to have all the relevant documents and instruction sets, timings, etc. So therefore the SoC can quite easily be throttled back to emulate all these commands that would have been split off over multiple chips and IRQs within the single environment, with room to spare. Remember, there's a lot more bandwidth here, which was one of the issues, as the Super FX chip would have hogged all of the ROM bus. Therefore, the CPU had no access to the ROM while the FX chip was operating. The functionality of the FX chip 2 was boosted, allowing it to write to both the sprite format and the background format, which was only available on the FX1. But here, with extra CPU to spare, it can emulate all of this in software, and not forgetting that little GPU as well. Now, some of this is used for the boost up to 720p via its HDMI output, and a post-process filter that applies to it, giving a CRT filter to the screen along with a collection of borders. This is all centered around the 4:3 display that was common at the time, but there is one extra option here, which is a 1:1 pixel mapping, which squashes the screen slightly to make sure that every pixel sits exactly in the same space of an equal 4:4 pixel. That's around 8:7, I think it works out at. Now, this is retained to keep the pixel art as close as possible across the 21 titles on offer. Well, nearly all of them anyway. The family reunion nearly 30 years after it launched is packed in a nostalgic box that mimics the launch console from the 90s, right down to the photo and collection of titles included. All it requires is a mullet or maybe curtains and it would be the real deal. The plastic casing is a carbon copy of the PAL and Japanese machine casing, right down to the eject, reset and power button, although only 2 of these actually work. American players get their own design for nostalgic reasons, and you have my condolences. Everything is an identical shrunken down version of the original machine. Aside, it now does not say PAL version on the cartridge slot. Then again, it doesn't work now anyway. Connections at the rear show the first real difference though, a powered slot that requires a separate plug or other USB supplied power source to get the thing turned on, via the supplied cable rather than the proprietary Nintendo AV connection that we see on the old machine. Instead replaced with a uniformed HDMI output. All games are upscaled to 720p, and with the options just mentioned you can get a pixel perfect match to the large 256x224 resolution of the Super Nintendo catalogue that most games ran under. Sadly, in the PAL regions here, we had a higher resolution of 288, which was mostly just used for black borders, giving us a lower resolution overall than what we normally expect, and a slower frame rate than our never the same colour twice American and Japanese PALs. It was tough being a European gamer in the 90s. Now the front hides the pop-out connections for the 2 supplied and equally perfect controllers that are for all intents and purposes identical to the originals, aside the connectors themselves and the slightly shorter leads, around 2/3 the length on the new machines. Now being so small and all games are preloaded, this can simply be hooked up to your TV or capture device of choice in seconds. No need for upscalers here, and then you are ready for a trip down memory lane. The effort they've put into emulate the 90s release is very commendable and welcome. In fact, everything here is smaller aside one thing. The manual is actually bigger on the new machine than it is on the old one. The irony, eh? In all aspects though, this is identical to last year's NES Mini. You are paying for the new games and where you place the need for those first, or another retro machine in your household. I'm sure it will be open soon to allow it to play other titles and even NES games itself, so it just depends on how long you wait for Nintendo to supply the market and who the hell hacks the crap out of it and see what it delivers. Once into the main screen, it is a suitable bordered and themed Super Famicom display. All the games can be easily picked from, and not all things are left in the past. Not only can games be saved mid-progress on the machine, so you can resume when needed without the need for single sitting completions or passwords that was very common back then, although some games did have on-cart saving. But you can also rewind large chunks of the game in real time just to help out those tougher moments and go back to that save and just move around as you see fit, and I'm sure Ghouls and Ghosts will max this feature out in no time. Now these boosts along with the extra visual features are a welcome addition to the device and offer something new over the base machine and allow a more modern style of gameplay. Filter options are welcome, but it would have been nice to merge the two, i.e. have the CRT filter on and the pixel perfect mode. You have to choose one or the other, and therefore the options around that. So that limits the options slightly, and even though I think the CRT filter is excellent and does a very good job of emulating the standard level of CRTs that most people would have had, therefore you have a slight blur on how it works on the cathode rays, it would have been nice to have an option to clean it back up, something more along the lines of what we saw in Sonic Mania, which I thought was very impressive in those options. So what about those games though that are included in the pack then? Well, Star Fox and its long since MIA sequel along with Yoshi's Island are the real stress tests of how good the emulator is. Right now, we have many ways to play these games on a variety of devices, including the original machines using EverDrives or ST2 SNES if you want the widest catalogue going. But even the mighty ST2 SNES cannot emulate all the extra chips that were shipped over the console's life. Using an FPGA within the car allows microcode to be altered to mimic the functions and timings for the target hardware, but this is largely achieved via reverse engineering. The nerd team here from Nintendo have no such limitation and instead have full access to all the required info, making this much easier, although not simple, to mimic the host hardware required across all the variety in this pack, like a digital chameleon. And the results largely are excellent. Comparing the Star Fox title between the original and the new one, we see 100% accurate reflection in movement response, well, ish, and frame rates. You would not know you were playing this all under a Linux-based emulator with no Mario chip in sight. The code would also limit the frame rate to its maximum, a theoretical 20 FPS, but even the same bandwidth limits and overall throughput have been factored into the experience to keep everything authentic. An option to virtually overclock the machine would have been nice, but this is Nintendo, and it was never going to be on the cards, maybe for a later mod perhaps. And it shows another boost to us Europeans here. Based on the NTSC originals, we see 60Hz rather than the PAL standard 50Hz. This is fields per second, not frames per second, even though the monitor now is all based on frames per second due to how we calculate frame rates now in modern day. Now this gives Star Fox a small boost to the frame rate of around 2 FPS, as does the mighty sequel. Now this has been a long time coming, and I'm enjoying my playthrough of this title from beginning to end. I never completed the release ROMs, and I'm happy that I can experience a brand new Super Nintendo title after all these years. It feels better than the first and really tried to expand the mold of that with walker sections, random maps and even bigger bosses, and more space fights as well. Lead programmer of Tomorrow's Children Dylan Cuthbert programmed the game to be very parallel, yes, parallel programming, back in the Super Nintendo days. Therefore both CPUs could work in tandem. This, along with some other tweaks, allowed him to increase the frame rate here, moving from a capped 20Hz up to 30Hz. But again, it's all theoretical. It's a good example of how stretched the machine was. 30 may have been the peak, but it's regularly around 15 and lower. A welcome benefit and a stellar title in the pack, but one that I'm sure that drew many into parting their £65 or $80 or euros that the machine costs. It's a welcome boost in this Super Nintendo package. In terms of the emulation quality, they are very close. There are minor issues sometimes, certainly in Super Ghouls and Ghosts here. You can see the background partially disappear, but this is minor. Sounds and plays excellent and can suck hours of your time as it balances that one more go factor. Now sound-wise, the emulation is very close. It doesn't sound exactly the same, but you'd really be struggling to pick up the difference between the two. You can have a listen for yourself here between Super Ghouls and Ghosts soundtrack. For those with a keen ear, the subtle difference you're hearing is likely down to the fact that it's obviously got far more channels to disperse the soundtrack, and therefore it's slightly cleaner across all the sound channels on the new Mini than it is on the old analog sound system of the Super Nintendo, so therefore you get a slightly louder sound and a cleaner mix on the new machine, but overall there's hardly anything in it, certainly not enough to get carried away and worry about. Now, one of the things that this title does show is the emulation for the slowdown is actually not 100% accurate, and I've tested this a few times, but you can see an example here. It slows down on the NTSC version here on the SNES Mini, but not on the PAL 50Hz version. This may be because it doesn't dip that low, but it's dipping to a sync of 30 FPS, so this emulation is ever so slightly off, and a few other titles, such as Contra, also exhibit a similar point where they slow down on the SNES Mini more than they do on genuine hardware that I'm testing here. But again, like the sound and some other small tweaks on the visual output, it's a very minor issue for what is essentially a £70 emulation kit. If you wanted to upscale your original Super Nintendo machine, bearing in mind the one I've got here is the only one we had in the PAL region, the dual chip SNES, which has a slightly worse output than some of the later smaller models that came out with a single chip, but these never launched in the UK. Lining up shots from both versions, you can see a similarity between the two is very, very close, but the pixel quality is much sharper on the new machine due to a higher resolution. Also, to keep it accurate to the time, I'm using composite cable rather than component cable, because that's how the art was intended, blending the colours rather than the sharp pixel graft between one colour and the next. It smoothly blends between the two, and this is what the CRT filter on the console itself is trying to emulate. So this emulation of faux raster lines and pixel emulation of a screen or a CRT is meant to look something like this, but this isn't how you want it. So it's the compromise between the two. On a large screen it would look terrible. If you zoom in on a real CRT like you see here, you can actually see each individual pixel, but actually it's the phosphor dots from the electron beam hitting the screen, and this is what they're trying to emulate, and quite successfully so. Contra 3 is another fan favourite and one of my own. I absolutely love the title and I think it delivers dual player action like few other titles. It does offer up another small difference between the emulation here. You can see, comparing the Super Nintendo original and the SMINI here, the background mode 7 scaling and rotation effects are of a higher resolution here on the SMINI. And this is similar to what you see on PC emulations as well. But I would have preferred maybe another Turrican game to come in, or something else along the lines of Final Fight to replace some of the titles here, such as Super Punch-Out, dropping that and put another action title in. The wealth of Mario games is obvious, but it misses out on the chance to offer a wider selection. The Super Nintendo was known for its huge RPG titles, which did not require a beefy CPU and fast animations. Boosted with the depth of colour the console enjoyed, they played into the machine's strengths and gave us some of the best titles we see here. Earthbound is a popular one, allegedly, but not here in the UK. Just like Mario RPG, it never got launched here in Europe, and we were really overall not into RPGs as much as our Japanese and American cousins. Final Fantasy III aside, and of course Link to the Past Legend of Zelda is ones that really excel, and they look, play and feel as excellent as ever here in this improved package. Street Fighter 2 is great here, but it's not the best version even on this machine, which is a shame, as is some of the other titles, but I've covered this already. I would have loved to have seen Axelate on here make the cut, as it is simply an incredible shooter on the machine that defied expectations of what could actually be achieved on it. A superb shooter overall. So is Super R-Type, Final Fight or Final Fight 3. They all could have been enjoyed here with the dropping of some of the other titles. I'm looking at you, Kirby, and Super Punch-Out. But maybe these were more Euro-inspired titles, and as such, this list is largely taken for the North American target audience. Even the Japanese release has the better Street Fighter packed in that we get here and our American cousins. Turtles in Time really should have been in here. It was an amazing game for the machine, and along with other titles was one of the reasons that the SNES took off with exclusive. Street Fighter is a big reason it even got so popular here in the UK, as that was a title you could only play on the Super Nintendo for a long period of time, although Mortal Kombat flipped that the other way when they took out the gore. Many titles here, and ones that are great. There's always a few that I'm sure many of you will be sitting there thinking, I wish this was on the list. Super Metroid is one that I find few would ever argue shouldn't have been on the list. It is absolutely excellent. The fact that it's here looks, feels and plays as good as ever, and it really oozes atmosphere. I'm really looking forward to diving back into this title after all these years, as it's been a while since I've played it properly, and I'm really going to enjoy it. But I'm sure there's many more, and I could bang on so long about all the ones that could have made the list or should have made the cut and stayed in retro obscurity. I would also like to know what games you would have liked to have seen, or if you are happy with the list, maybe I can cover some of them in future retro episodes. Yes, technical enthusiasts may sit there now and say, but it's a simple Pi-powered device, but that misses the point of the machine entirely. This is a trip down memory lane. This includes the looks, sounds, feels and smells of the box, the console and the controller, as much a part of everything as the games themselves. A low asking price for pixel and pitch perfect ports of 21 titles, one of which you can only get officially here, is a real bargain. Even more so when you look at the second hand price of some of these games in the list. It offers up a simple way to dive into classic 16-bit action without the need for a SCART lead, connection, upscaler or other such tricks. For the full experience, of course, real hardware is always the best way to go. Grabbing a second-hand machine and an ST2 SNES or EverDrive, you can check out the link below from Retro Towers, would be an equally, if not more so, worthy investment, opening up over 95% of the entire catalogue with no need to swap carts, hunt for them in the box and blow away the dust, completed by the fact this is all being run on real hardware with no emulators in sight. But this doesn't take away from anything that the Super Nintendo Mini here delivers, or the SMINI as I now will call it. The fact Nintendo have stated they will supply more to the market is a good thing, but the chances of getting one for Christmas or the holiday season are low at this point. So if this has sparked your nostalgic bone, then check out Retro Towers and your local eBay to see what a full Super Nintendo Suite could cost as an early present to yourself or significant other. I will leave my SMINI in pride of place for the next few weeks and enjoy some epic replays of leisure of all these titles throughout this pack. That this is a little box that offers a cheap way to relive some of those past glories. And can you really put a price on that? If you can, I'm sure it'll be a hell of a lot less than what they're asking for it here. Now I will see you all next year when this repeat analysis comes up with the N64 Mini, and we can start another argument over just what games should have been on that list and which ones were robbed. As always, you can leave your thoughts and feedback below, along with the games you wanted in the pack, and maybe ones you want to look back on in future episodes. If you did like this or my other fountain of work, then maybe subscribe, like or share, and possibly even support me on Patreon, as I am self-funded and independent, and this is not as easy or as quick as I make it look at times. Take care, play well, and snuggle into the nostalgia, which you can keep feeding if you look at my other retro episodes. I'll catch you on the next one.